Welcome to Neural Battlefields. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is not a horror story pulled from the imagination of a writer sitting in a dark room somewhere. It is history. Real, documented, undeniable history. And it is, without question, one of the darkest chapters the human race has ever been forced to reckon with. So take a breath, because today we are going into a place most people do not even know existed, and by the end of this, you will understand why the world made a silent, uncomfortable decision to look away from it for decades. Today, we are talking about Unit 731. Before we begin, if you are new here, welcome to Neural Battlefields, a channel where we do not shy away from the complicated, the disturbing, and the forgotten corners of history that shape the world we live in today. If that sounds like your kind of content, stick around. And if you have been here before, you already know what we do. Now, let us get into it. To understand Unit 731, you have to understand the world that gave birth to it. The 1930s were a period of radical nationalism, imperial ambition, and a deeply dangerous belief held by several powerful nations that some human lives were simply worth more than others. In Japan, this ideology had been building for decades. The country had modernized at a stunning pace since the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s, transforming itself from a feudal society into a military and industrial power in a matter of generations. By the 1930s, Japan had already colonized Korea, was exerting enormous pressure across East Asia, and had set its eyes on China as the next stage of an expanding empire. When the Imperial Japanese Army invaded Manchuria in 1931 and established the puppet state of Manchukuo, they did not just take territory. They took something far more sinister. They took the opportunity to operate outside of any legal, moral, or international framework. And into that vacuum walked a man named Shiro Ishii. Shiro Ishii was, by any measure, a brilliant man. He was a physician, a microbiologist, and a military officer who had spent time in Europe studying the aftermath of World War I. What he saw in that war convinced him of something terrifying. Biological weapons, he believed, were the future of warfare. Disease as a weapon, pathogens as ammunition, the human body itself as a battlefield. He returned to Japan consumed by this idea, and he spent years lobbying, arguing, and convincing military leadership that Japan needed a biological weapons research program, unlike anything that had ever existed. In 1932, Ishii got his wish. A secret unit was established, initially operating under the name Togo Unit, later reorganized and expanded. By 1936, with the full backing of Emperor Hirohito's military apparatus, it was formally established near the city of Harbin in Manchuria, in a place called Pingfang, and it was given a name that told you absolutely nothing about what happened inside its walls. It was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, but the world would come to know it by a different name entirely, Unit 731. The facility at Pingfang was not a small operation. This was not a few researchers in a basement. By the time it reached its full scale, the complex covered over 6 square kilometers. It had more than 150 buildings, including laboratories, living quarters, a prison block, an airfield, a power plant, and even a cinema and recreational facilities for its staff. At its peak, Unit 731 employed somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 personnel, including some of Japan's most educated and talented scientists and physicians. These were people who had taken oaths to heal, people who had studied for years to understand the human body, to protect it, to preserve life. And they came here to Pingfang, and they did the opposite. The prisoners held at Unit 731 were referred to, in the cold and deliberately dehumanizing language of the facility, as maruda. The word means logs in Japanese. Logs, not patients, not people. Logs, raw material to be processed, used, and discarded. The vast majority of these prisoners were Chinese civilians and resistance fighters, along with Soviet citizens, Mongolians, and a smaller number of Koreans. Some were captured soldiers. Many were civilians who had done nothing more than exist in a place where Japanese forces were hunting for subjects. They were transferred to Pingfang under the guise of being sent to a labor camp or a prison, often not knowing where they were going until the gates closed behind them. What happened to them inside those gates is the part of this story that the human mind resists, not because it is difficult to understand, but because understanding it requires accepting that the people who did these things were not monsters from a fairy tale. They were educated professionals, many of them fathers and husbands, people who ate dinner and slept and laughed. And they walked into those laboratories every morning and did things that no word in any language has ever been strong enough to describe. The experiments at Unit 731 were not random. They were methodical, documented, and conducted with the rigor that a legitimate medical research institution would apply to its work. That is what makes them so uniquely horrifying. This was not cruelty born of rage. It was cruelty born of curiosity, ambition, and a complete and total erasure of the human beings who were being used. Plague research was one of the central focuses of the facility. Ishii and his researchers were obsessed with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, along with a range of other pathogens including cholera, typhoid, anthrax, tuberculosis, and hemorrhagic fever. Prisoners were deliberately infected with these diseases, not through natural exposure but through direct injection, force-feeding of contaminated food and water, and intentional exposure to infected fleas and insects. Researchers then monitored the progression of disease in living human subjects, measuring, documenting, and in many cases performing vivisection, meaning surgery on a living, conscious person, to observe the internal effects of infection in real time. Anesthesia was rarely used, not because it was unavailable, but because researchers believed it might affect the results. Let that settle for a moment. These were living, conscious human beings, awake and aware, undergoing surgery not to save their lives but to observe the progress of diseases that had been deliberately put inside them. The biological weapons research did not stop at internal infection. Unit 731 developed methods of weaponizing pathogens for battlefield use. They created ceramic bombs, called Uji bombs, specifically designed to carry and disperse plague-infected fleas over enemy populations. They tested aerial delivery systems for cholera and typhoid. They even, on multiple documented occasions, conducted field tests of these weapons on actual Chinese cities and populations. The cities of Zhangxiang, Guizhou, Ningbo, and others were targeted with aerial drops of plague-infected fleas. Outbreaks followed. People died in communities far from Pingfang, killed by weapons they never saw, fired by an enemy they may not have even known was overhead. But the biological program, as staggering as it was only one part of what Unit 731 did. The facility also conducted extensive research into the limits of human survival. What happens to a human body at extreme cold? Prisoners were taken outside in Manchurian winters, where temperatures could drop to -40 degrees, and their limbs or their entire bodies were exposed until the flesh froze. Researchers then experimented with various methods of thawing, including pouring boiling water over frozen limbs, to observe which methods caused the most damage and which might be used to treat soldiers in the field. The prisoners who survived this were used again, and again, until they could not be used anymore. Pressure experiments were conducted to determine how much atmospheric change the human body could withstand. Prisoners were placed in sealed chambers and subjected to rapidly increasing pressure, causing gases in the body to expand. Researchers documented what happened when the human body was pushed past every limit nature had placed on it. Similar experiments were conducted with centrifuges, spinning subjects at increasing speeds to observe the point at which the human cardiovascular system would fail. Dehydration experiments were run to observe how long a person could survive without water, and what physical changes occurred during the process of dying from thirst. Prisoners were placed in heated rooms and dehydrated to calculate exactly how much of a person's body weight was composed of water, using the most direct and disturbing possible method of measurement. Surgeons at the facility practiced removing organs, transplanting limbs, and crossing the blood of different individuals, not to develop life-saving techniques, but often simply to see what would happen. There are documented accounts of limbs being amputated and reattached to opposite sides of the body, of stomachs being removed and esophagi connected directly to intestines, of organs being removed entirely while subjects were kept alive as long as possible afterward. These procedures were not performed to test a specific hypothesis aimed at saving lives. They were performed in an atmosphere that had abandoned every principle medicine was built upon. The question that haunts every serious historian who studies this period is the same question that haunts every person who hears this story for the first time. How? How did this happen? How did thousands of trained, educated, intelligent people participate in this, day after day, for years? The answer is both simple and deeply uncomfortable. Dehumanization works. When you strip a group of people of their humanity in language, in policy, and in daily practice, you make it possible for otherwise ordinary people to do extraordinary evil. The prisoners of Unit 731 were not called patients or prisoners or even enemies. They were called logs. They were coded as something less than human, something to be used and processed. And the culture of the facility, combined with the authority structures of the imperial Japanese military, and the broader ideology of Japanese racial and national superiority that had been cultivated for decades, created an environment where participation felt not just permissible but patriotic. This is not a uniquely Japanese phenomenon, and it is important to say that clearly. The history of human experimentation without consent stretches across cultures and continents. What made Unit 731 exceptional was its scale, its systematic nature, and the fact that it was state-sponsored, scientifically organized, and deliberately concealed for decades after the war ended. Because here is where the story takes another dark turn. Unit 731 did not end with justice. As the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August of 1945 and began advancing into Manchuria, Ishii ordered the rapid destruction of the Pingfang facility. Buildings were demolished. Evidence was burned. The remaining prisoners, estimated to be around 400 individuals, were killed to prevent them from being found and interviewed by Soviet forces. The animals used in experiments were released or killed. Staff members were scattered. Ishii himself ordered his personnel to sign oaths of silence, warning them that what they had done and what they had witnessed was never to be spoken of. The Soviet forces captured some members of Unit 731 and put them on trial in 1949 in what became known as the Khabarovsk war crimes trials. 12 Japanese military personnel were convicted and sentenced to imprisonment in Soviet labor camps. But the event was largely dismissed in the West as Soviet propaganda during the early years of the Cold War, and the convictions did not significantly enter the global consciousness. The United States, meanwhile, had made a very different decision. American intelligence officials, through what became known as Operation Paper, negotiated immunity from war crimes prosecution for the leadership of Unit 731, including Shiro Ishii himself, in exchange for access to the research data the unit had produced. The Americans were told that the biological weapons research, conducted on human subjects over more than a decade, represented scientific data that could not be reproduced through any ethical means, and that it would be of immense value to American biological weapons programs. The deal was made. Ishii and the senior leadership of Unit 731 were never prosecuted by American authorities. They were debriefed, their data was handed over, and they were allowed to live out the rest of their lives in Japan. Shiro Ishii died in 1959 of throat cancer, a free man. Many of his colleagues went on to distinguished careers in Japanese medicine, academia, and public health. Some became professors. Some founded pharmaceutical companies. Some received honors and recognition for their work in the years after the war. The victims had no equivalent trajectory. There were no honors for them. There were no careers. There was no old age. For decades, the Chinese government pushed for recognition and acknowledgement of what had happened at Pingfang and at the other sites where Unit 731 conducted field experiments. For decades, the Japanese government maintained an official position of denial. It was not until 2002 that Japan formally acknowledged the existence of Unit 731 in a court ruling. And even then, the acknowledgement stopped far short of the kind of comprehensive reckoning that the scale of the atrocity demanded. The physical site of the Pingfang facility now exists as a museum in the Harbin district of what is today China. The Unit 731 Museum opened in 1985 and has been expanded several times since, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The ruins of the main building, the boiler house, the frostbite experimental chamber, and the remains of the prison block still stand. Walking through them, visitors encounter the physical remnants of a place where the language of science was borrowed and corrupted to serve a purpose that had nothing to do with the advancement of human knowledge and everything to do with the exercise of power over human bodies. What remains of the victims themselves is, in many cases, literally nothing. The bodies of prisoners who died during experiments were incinerated in the facility's crematoriums. In some cases, bones and remains were preserved for research purposes and later discovered or repatriated. In 2011, skeletal remains of what may have been Unit 731 victims were discovered at the former site of a medical school in Tokyo. The investigation that followed confirmed that the remains showed signs consistent with surgical experimentation. The full accounting of who those people were has never been completed. The number of people killed at Unit 731 and its related facilities, including Unit 100, Unit 516, and other branch units that operated across occupied China, is disputed by historians. Conservative estimates place the death toll at around 3,000 from direct experimentation at Pingfang alone. When you factor in the field tests of biological weapons on Chinese civilian populations, the numbers climb dramatically. Some estimates suggest that the biological warfare campaigns conducted using weapons developed at Unit 731 killed tens of thousands of people. The true number may never be known. There is a pattern in human history that we return to again and again on this channel, and it is this. The moments where humanity descends into its worst expressions are almost never sudden. They are built. They are constructed over time, through layers of ideology, dehumanization, institutional encouragement, and the slow erosion of the individual's sense of responsibility to the people around them. Unit 731 did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a specific political and cultural context, enabled by imperial ambition, racial ideology, the pressures of wartime, and the seductive power of scientific authority in an age that worshipped progress. Understanding this is not a comfortable exercise. It is not meant to be, but it is necessary because the mechanisms that produced Unit 731 are not unique to Japan in the 1930s. They are human mechanisms. They live in every society that allows ideology to override ethics, that permits institutions to operate without accountability, that allows the powerful to define some people as less than human. The scientists who worked at Pingfang were not born knowing how to vivisect a living person. They were trained into it. By their environment, by their institutional culture, by the progressive normalization of increasingly extreme acts, and by a system that rewarded participation and punished dissent. This is one of the most important lessons that Unit 731 has to offer, and it is a lesson that costs us something to receive. It costs us the comfort of thinking that this kind of evil belongs only to a particular nation, or a particular era, or a particular type of person. It does not. What happened at Unit 731 happened because of human choices made by human beings who were the product of human systems, which means the responsibility of understanding it, of preventing its echoes, and of honoring the memory of its victims belongs not to any one nationality or culture, but to all of us. In Japan, the conversation around Unit 731 remains complicated, and to many outside observers insufficient. While some Japanese historians, activists, and educators have worked hard to bring the history of Unit 731 into public consciousness, including pushing for its inclusion in school curricula, they have faced significant resistance from nationalist groups and from a political culture that is deeply uncomfortable with the more difficult aspects of imperial-era history. Survivors and descendants of victims, primarily in China, have pursued lawsuits in Japanese courts seeking acknowledgement and compensation. Those lawsuits, almost without exception, have failed on the grounds of legal technicalities or have been dismissed with acknowledgement of the facts but a refusal to award damages. This is a grief that has no formal address. There has been no equivalent of the Nuremberg trials for Unit 731. There has been no comprehensive international reckoning. The data purchased by American intelligence agencies in exchange for immunity was folded quietly into research programs and never fully declassified. The men who ran the program lived and died in comfort. And the people who were brought to Pingfang, who were called logs and treated as less than human, have been left to the care of historians, activists, and the occasional documentary. Which brings us back to why stories like this one matter. Not because they are satisfying, because this one is not. There is no satisfying ending here. There is no moment where justice prevails and the right people are held accountable, and history closes the book with a clean conscience. There is only the truth, uncomfortable and incomplete and demanding something from us, demanding that we look at it directly, demanding that we hold it without flinching, demanding that we carry it forward as a warning about what human beings are capable of when the right conditions are in place. The approximately 3,000 people who died inside the walls of Pingfang from direct experimentation, and the many more who died in the field tests of the weapons developed there, deserve to be known, not as statistics, not as entries in a casualty report, but as people who had lives before those gates closed behind them. People who had families and histories and futures that were taken from them in the service of a program that the world spent decades pretending it could not fully see. We see it now, or at least we are trying to. And on this channel, the commitment we make to you is that we will keep trying with every story we tell, every corner of history we walk into, every uncomfortable truth we refuse to look away from. The year was 1945 when the fires at Pingfang were lit and the buildings were destroyed and the oaths of silence were taken. 80 years have passed. The ruins still stand. The museum still receives its visitors. The researchers who can still be located are elderly or gone. The political conversations are still unresolved. And somewhere in the historical record, in archives in Beijing and Tokyo and Washington and Moscow, there are documents that tell more of this story than we yet know how to read. History is not finished with Unit 731, and Unit 731 is not finished with history. That is where we leave this today, not with resolution because there is none to offer, but with the weight of knowing, which is, perhaps, the most important thing we can carry out of a story like this one. If this documentary meant something to you, if it made you think, if it challenged you, if it left you with questions you want to explore further, then do something with that. Share this video with someone who you think should know this history. There are people in your life who have never heard the name Unit 731, and they should. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, your questions, or anything this story stirred in you. We read every single one. And if you have not already, subscribe to Neural Battlefields because this is what we do here. We do not look away. We go into the hard places together and we come out more informed, more aware, and more committed to understanding the world as it actually is, not as we wish it had been. Hit the like button if this video was worth your time. It helps more people find this content, and more people finding content like this is, in a small but real way, a way of making sure that stories like this one do not stay buried. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring enough to sit with something this difficult for this long. This has been Neural Battlefields. We will see you in the next one.